Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Our panel is going to get started in just a minute, but before we get into it, I wanted to give everybody a quick introduction and thank you for being here. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you have found your way to this webinar but are not familiar with the League, we are a New York statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. And because we're a nonprofit, we rely on people like you to make the work we do possible. So thank you for your support. And I also want to give a special shout out to our program sponsor, the Gary Trust. They've been funding the Future of Preservation webinar series that this event is part of. So thank you to the Gary Trust. The League does our work in lots of ways, lots of different programming. We have technical services, grants, our 7 to Save list of endangered historic sites, public policy and advocacy that we do at local, state, and federal levels, our Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards, and public programs like this one. And so today, we're really excited to be telling the full story and talking about what that means at historic sites around the state. This is something that we've been thinking a lot about lately, and it definitely seems like the tide is starting to turn. But there's a lot of work to do, right? And so we wanted to get a group together today who are doing the work and doing really good work around New York State. And so we are going to shine a light on a few examples of places around New York that are working to tell the full story of their historic sites, because we know that history does not begin and end with white settler colonialism. There are many more people and many more stories that need to be told, and many marginalized groups that have been systematically erased from the narrative. And so as we think through how we move forward in a way that, recognizes a more complete picture of who built this country and who built our historic sites, we're thinking through how programming and outreach can really shine a light on different groups. And so we are really excited to be partnering with the Museum Association of New York on this particular webinar. And so I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Megan, but before I do, I just want to give a couple housekeeping notes. So as our panelists are speaking, if you have questions for them, please drop your questions in the Q&A box. Our moderator will get to as many audience questions as possible during the group discussion at the end. We also have a chat function. I will be monitoring the chat function, so if you have any general questions, you can drop them there, or just general comments. If any of our panelists mention something that I can pull up a link for, I will drop them there as well. And I will mention that this program is being recorded. It is streaming live on our Facebook page at this exact moment. And the recording will also be uploaded to YouTube after we are done here today. So you can find it in a couple different ways in case you can't stay for the whole thing or just want to relive any of it. You can find it, and I will drop some of those links in the chat as well. And so now I'm going to hand it off to Megan Eaves from Museum Association of New York. She's going to be kicking us off with a land acknowledgement, and she'll be introducing our panelists. So thanks, Megan.
Thank you so much, Katie. Yes, my name is Megan Eaves. I am the Marketing and Communications Associate for the Museum Association of New York. We are a statewide organization that represents New York State museums, historic sites, botanical gardens, zoos, and aquaria, and offer professional services across the field. Like Katie said, I do want to start with a land acknowledgement. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohegan people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. The Museum Association of New York, we're so happy to be here today with the Preservation League of New York State for this webinar. And I am very excited and honored to introduce you to our panelists. Donnamarie Barnes, she has spent over 30 years working in the editorial photography field before joining Sylvester Manor Educational Farm in 2014 as the volunteer and history docent, before becoming the curator and archivist in 2016. Her work to uncover the lives and identities of the enslaved and indigenous peoples of the Manor is ongoing and is an integral part of the Manor's mission to preserve, cultivate, and share the stories of all the people of Sylvester Manor. Meredith Soren Horsford has served as the executive director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum since 2015. And in 2019, she spearheaded an extensive research project on the enslaved and free Black men and women that were instrumental in the prosperity of the Dyckman farm. Her goal at the museum is to connect the past with the present through programs such as a reoccurring race lecture series, contemporary art installations highlighting the Black experience in America, and urban agricultural programs. Lizela Franz is the executive director of Historic Huguenot Street and previously served as the director of Historic Cherry Hill in Albany and program director and then assistant director of the Federation of Historical Services in Troy, New York. She is a peer reviewer for the accreditation program of the American Alliance of Museums and has also served as a panelist for the New York Council for the Humanities, the New Jersey Historical Commission, and the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Lavada Nahon has more than 18 years of public history experience working with a variety of historic sites and museums across New York State, developing educational programs, after-school programs, lectures and tours, period presentation, and historic dinners. She is currently the interpreter of African American history for the New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Places Bureau of Historic Sites, and is a culinary historian focused on the 17th to 19th century Mid-Atlantic region, with an emphasis on the work of enslaved cooks in the homes of the elite class. And today's webinar is moderated by Suzanne Clary, who is a member of the Preservation League of New York's Board of Trustees and serves as co-chair of the League's leadership giving group, the Excelsior Society. She currently serves as the president of the J Heritage Center in Rye, New York. So welcome panelists, welcome all of you, and I will turn it over to Donnamarie Barnes to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to the Preservation League of New York and to Manny. It's an honor to be here this afternoon to talk to you all. And if you give me a moment, we will share my screen. There we go. All right. Okay. All right. As Megan introduced, I'm Donnamarie Barnes, and I'm the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor, which is located on Shelter Island on the east end of Long Island in New York. We are a not-for-profit organization that has operated since 2009, and our mission has always been to cultivate, preserve, and share historic Sylvester Manor. We tell the stories of all the people who lived and worked on this land. We are stewards to a 1737 Georgian manor house, an 1810 windmill, and a present-day organic farm operation. And we are situated on 235 acres of land, which was the ancestral home of the indigenous people of the Manhasset tribe. In our effort to tell the stories of all the people of Sylvester Manor who lived and worked here, we use documents, records, mentions of names and last wills and testaments and inventories, and the landscape itself. From the names listed and what we know, we are able to imagine their lives here through 350 years of the settlement, when Sylvester Manor was established in 1651 as a provisioning plantation to a sugarcane operation on the island of Barbados. Nathaniel Sylvester, an Englishman born in the Netherlands, came here with enslaved Africans to clear the land, to raise crops, livestock, and to harvest timber for barrel staves to be shipped to the West Indies. The lives of the enslaved people here are no more than actually just their names are listed. And from that, we have to infer what their lives were. Because this landscape has been unchanged for hundreds of years, this property descended from the same family, through the same family for 11 generations before becoming a nonprofit. And so walking the grounds, it is sometimes easy to imagine what their lives may have been. There are echoes of memory that are held for me deep in the landscape. As a photographer myself, walking the grounds, looking for inspiration and ways of telling these stories deeper and deeper, I find that inspiration from the land itself, walking through the woods, listening to the sounds of nature, imagining being here. As beautiful as this landscape is, this was also a prison. This is an island surrounded by, within the forks of another island. Escape was virtually impossible. The isolation, the loneliness, the trauma of all of that is imbued in the land itself for us. Again, using records to find the names, to be able to call their names as we walk the land, as we share the stories. The names of Tomaru and Oyo and their children, Tony and Obium. Tomaru and Oyo were African born and brought to this country, to this land from Barbados. Through archaeological study, which we have done extensively for the last 20 years in a partnership with the University of Massachusetts at Boston, over 1 million artifacts have been uncovered. And from those artifacts, we gain stories. This one, for example, is an earthenware pot that when analyzed, was discovered that the design on the pot is a traditional indigenous Native American design. However, the technique used to make the clay, grinding it and mixing it with shell and then firing the ceramics was in fact actually a technique used in West Africa, in Nigeria. The pot also includes the presence of a handle, which is not indicative of traditional indigenous pottery or African pottery. It's a European device. And so this artifact for us at Sylvester Manor exemplifies the coming together of these three people. This pot was made by an indigenous Manhasset woman aided by an enslaved African woman, both in service of a white European woman. We call this pot jazz. It is unique to Sylvester Manor and to Shelter Island. And within it holds all the magic and the mysteries of the stories that we continue to tell. There is no one artifact that points indicatively to the presence of enslaved people, but it's through these particular artifacts, such as a thimble, a sewing needle, straight pins, that point to me towards the facts of the lives of women and the work of women who were present here during the time. Coupling that with the names that I know, you can imagine what their lives were and how they lived here. Moving forward, there is always more to uncover. There's more research to be done. There's more references to find, and there's more ideas to be learned from the landscape itself. This is our Afro-Indigenous burial ground, where we are presently underway with a new project of clearing out the dead trees, uncovering more of the landscape and the topography. The graves, which we believe to be number up to 200, are only indicated by the placement of stones, footstones and headstones, unmarked field stones just placed in the landscape. 20 years ago, the University of Massachusetts archaeological team did ground penetrating radar here, which did uncover the presence of up to 200 individuals. In that time, technology has advanced, and we are about to embark on a new project here at the burial ground, using ground penetrating radar again and mapping techniques to learn all that we can. We are entering into this project with a new partnership with the Shinnecock Tribal Nation of Southampton. The indigenous Manhasset people, when they left Shelter Island after the purchase of the island by the partners from Barbados, interspersed with other local tribal clans of the Montaukets and the Shinnecock. And so this is, in fact, the Shinnecock's ancestral land, and to have them be partners in this new work is a very exciting, healing, and transformative endeavor for all of us to uncover new stories, traditions, cultural sharing, and we are very excited about it. The burial ground is marked by a 19th century stone placed here by the descendants of Nathaniel Sylvester, the Horsford family. The stone reads, "The burying ground of the colored people of Sylvester Manor since 1651. We honor this space as sacred land on this property. It is the resting place of the enslaved and indigenous people who are the ancestors of our place and the original founders of not just Sylvester Manor, but of Shelter Island and the East End of Long Island and New York. We place the names of the enslaved women on what is known as the slave staircase in the 1737 Manor House. These stairs lead to the first floor bedrooms and then to the attic space where the enslaved lived and worked. The only image we have of a person of color is the woman in the photograph on the right. Her name is Julia Dyed Havens Johnson. She was a freeborn woman of color who lived nearby and worked at the manor for all of her life. And she is the last known person to be buried in the Afro-Indigenous burial ground in 1908. The land that she inherited from her formerly enslaved stepfather was bought back from her little by little by the family living at the manor, far below market value. Telling her story is an ongoing endeavor for me, and uncovering any other bits of information, mentions of her that I find on inventories and account books helps to flesh out the whole story of free people of color being present here on Sylvester Manor, even after slavery ended. The last manumitted person here was freed in 1820. As we move forward into the future, we hope to join with other organizations in New York who are doing similar work. We find coincidences and commonalities between us in how we tell the story and how we bring it to the public. More and more, we are enriching our story to include the narrative of more than just the European settlers or the European families through which these properties descended, because this was never just their story. It is all of our stories. It's the history of New York, it's the history of Long Island, and it's the history of the United States. And I welcome all of you to come out to Shelter Island to visit us on the East End. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Meredith Soren Horsford, who will discuss the work that she does at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Let's hope so. Thanks so much, Katie and Megan, and thanks for kicking us off, Donnamarie. Just pull this up. Okay. So hi, everyone. As you've heard, my name is Meredith Horsford. I'm the executive director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in Upper Manhattan. Thanks so much for joining us today. I wanted to give a brief background first and talk about some of the programs that kind of led us to where we are today at the museum. This is just a really brief timeline of the history of the site. Jan Dyckman first comes to this country in the 1660s from the Netherlands. Ultimately, the farmhouse, which is where we are in this picture, is built in 1784 in what we now call Upper Manhattan, but what was then very rural farmland and not part of New York City. At its peak, the Dyckmans owned approximately 250 acres of farmland. And this neighborhood, interestingly enough, was not actually developed until the 1920s and 30s. Just a few historic pictures of the farmhouse just to show the kind of evolving community around it as the city kind of grows up around the museum. And a few collections pictures. In addition to Dyckman family objects, our collection also includes objects found by amateur archaeologist Reginald Pelham Bolton, who did excavations across northern Manhattan prior to the opening of the museum in 1916. Many of the objects date to the Revolutionary War, as well as artifacts from indigenous people and Inwood family farms. And this is our neighborhood today. We're located in a very busy neighborhood that is really kind of has this imaginary dividing line of Broadway, which is what we are located on. So east of Broadway is traditionally where the Spanish-speaking community lives, and west of Broadway is traditionally where families that predominantly speak English live, and some in our community called the gentrifiers. The city has really grown up around the farmhouse, and today we are on a half acre of park that remains of what was originally vast farmland, I'm sorry. The museum engages with the community through partnerships with local businesses and nonprofit organizations to run programs at the farm and throughout the neighborhood. There are a variety of events that take place, including our summer STEAM camp for kids, history lectures, live music, specialized tours, bilingual story time, and many, many others. Our community is approximately 70% Spanish speaking, with the largest group being people who have moved here from the Dominican Republic. When I arrived at the museum in 2015, there really was not much of a relationship between the museum and the community. As you saw in the picture, we're kind of up on this embankment. So there was a bit of a divide and not much interaction between the museum and the community. So today we use community engagement and public programming to connect with our neighborhood, with our Dominican neighbors, with our neighbors of African descent, and with all of our local residents and with tourists. One of the first steps that the museum took to connect with the community was really breaking down barriers. Physical barriers that blocked visitors from entering rooms were taken down, while the cultural barrier of language was eliminated through bilingual signs, room labels, and communication with the community. The development of bilingual public programs cultivated a new relationship with the neighborhood to connect the historical narrative of the museum with today's community. Here are just a few images of some of our public programs and events, just to get an idea of the landscape and the kinds of things that we do. So we've found over the years that really the best way for us to connect with our community is through finding common threads. So with a grant from the New York Community Trust, we hired a part-time research assistant to uncover information about the people who were enslaved on the Dyckman farm and other farms nearby in the neighborhood. With new information, we designed new educational materials for the museum, created public programs, and engaged local artists to produce site-specific installations that communicate the story of underrepresented people. This project reinforces the importance of inclusive historical narratives in America's historical institutions of all sizes. As we continue our research, we're making some discoveries about the lives of the enslaved and free Black people that lived in the Dyckman farmhouse, as well as on neighboring farms. While much research is still being undertaken, I wanted to share with you what we have found so far. So Hannah, family tradition tells of a free Black woman named Hannah who lived with the family and worked as a cook. Based on those stories, we believe that she was living in the farmhouse around 1820. According to census records, Hannah was born between 1784 and 1794, which would make her between the ages of 26 and 36 in 1820. A 1917 legislature states the following, quote, "The cook, Black Hannah, who had been born on the place as the daughter of a slave who was partly of Indian blood. Tradition describes her with a right-colored headgear, face black as ebony, temper decidedly irregular, and a strong leaning toward a corncob pipe." The first enslaved person that we knew of by full name in Dyckman family history is Francis Cujo, who was manumitted in 1809 by Jacobus Dyckman. He lived and worked on the farm roughly a decade prior to Hannah, but their time at the farmhouse may have overlapped. The Dyckmans did not keep records of the people that they enslaved, and therefore some of this information is nearly impossible to find. However, the person that we have the most visual description about is a man named Will, through a runaway slave ad. These ads were known to be full of detail, including phenotypic appearance, clothing, languages spoken, and talents, such as playing an instrument. This May 1765 runaway slave ad placed by Jacob Dyckman of Kingsbridge for a $3 reward for Will, described as, quote, "a Negro fellow named Will or Wiltshire, about 40 years old, 5 feet 8 inches high, very crooked legs, had on what he went away, a blue broadcloth coat, very short, homespun trousers, a beaver hat, half worn, with a hole through the rim." Will was enslaved by Jacob Dyckman, the brother of William Dyckman, who built today's standing farmhouse. He is also the father of Garrett and Stotts Dyckman. We also have records of the people that they enslaved as well. We've discovered copies of 2 news articles pertaining to Gilbert Horton, a Black man enslaved by Stotts Dyckman. An August 1826 article stated he was found, imprisoned, and was to be sold. Soon after, this was countered by a September 1826 article stating that he was a free man who had served Stotts Dyckman and was manumitted after his father, Peter Horton, served Stotts for 1 year for Gilbert's freedom. We have also learned about Harry through an 1809 emancipation record describing him as, quote, mulatto, who was enslaved by Garrett Dyckman. He was born in 1777, making him 32 when he was freed. H. Dorothea Romer's Jan Dyckman and Descendants text tells of the location of a burial ground behind the previous farmhouse homestead. Quote, for years after Jacob's marriage, the 2 families lived in the Dyckman house together. The burial ground lay immediately behind the house, and in unhallowed ground beyond were the graves of over 30 family slaves. Today, this is the location of PS 98's faculty parking lot on 212th Street between Broadway and 10th Avenue. This is just northeast of the farmhouse. The graves were dug up and destroyed during the progress of urbanizing Upper Manhattan in the early 20th century. Reginald Pelham Bolton is quoted as saying, the remains of these humble workers of the past reminds us of the time when, even in this neighborhood, the practice of slavery was customary. Perhaps no other relic of the past could more decidedly mark the difference between the past and the present than the bones of these poor, unwilling immigrants whose labors cleared the primeval forest, cultivated the unturned sods, and prepared the way for the civilization that followed. We feel that it is integral to who we are as an organization to bring this information to the forefront and have conversations with our community about it. We do this through art installations and public programs. We participated in a press conference on August 1st, 2018, with our then New York State Senator Marisol Alcantara to create a memorial at the Inwood African Burial Ground. Since then, we've continued the Dyckman Discovered Research Project and the partnerships that we have created through it. We are currently working with PS 98 on a plaque exhibition and hopefully at some point curriculum development to make sure that the students at the school are aware of this sacred site. The Bowery Residence Committee provides housing and services for people experiencing homelessness in New York City. They may be purchasing land as a future site for a shelter, part of which was part of the African burial ground. After learning about the site's history, they stopped development activity and created Aegis, the advisory group for the Inwood Sacred Site. Through late 2020 and early 2021, they held meetings with Aegis as well as public community conversations to learn about the community's thoughts on how this important history might be integrated into the shelter through architecture and programming. And that's something that we were very heavily involved in. In 2019, we collaborated with local artist Pierre Hoffmeister, who created a year-long site-specific art installation that was inspired by the unmarked African burial grounds in Upper Manhattan and in Hunts Point in the Bronx. We continue to work with PS 98 and BRC to honor the African burial ground in Inwood, which had also been the site of Lenape ceremonial pits. Unspoken Voices, Honoring the Legacy of Black America, launched last fall as an exhibition centered on the Dyckman Discovered Initiative. In response to the revelations of the biographical information found on the people that the Dyckmans enslaved, Unspoken Voices artists have debuted works that directly engage with the data, including the transformation of the family's leisurely front parlor, seen here in the top right corner, into a space honoring the enslaved people. Sketches and clothing designs that mimic the daily life, fashion, and highlighting the humanity of those enslaved, and portraits depicting African Americans interacting with nature, inner spirit, and the struggle of forced labor in New York City. No Records was a public projection exhibition that addressed how we see and know history in the present day. Artist Reggie Black said, "The history of enslavement is deep in New York City, not just in the South as sometimes perceived. Every day we walk past buildings and streets named after slave owners. For us, Black people, to tell our own stories is a powerful confrontation of that history. Let's put that on display too." Moved by the important research that we've been conducting and the murder of George Floyd, we created Talking About Race Matters, Join the Conversation, a virtual lecture series, which we hosted first in August of 2020. We have featured professionals in the fields of history, anthropology, archaeology, Africana and Latinx studies, women and gender studies, music, and dance to talk about race from different perspectives. We are hosting our third series beginning in August, and I hope that you will all join us. Check our website for more information. The theme is reestablishing sites, introducing an inclusive narrative to cultural and educational institutions. We believe that through this lecture series, we can create a stronger connection with our community and foster conversations that can move us forward. To raise awareness about our project and about these important people, we created a t-shirt that highlights the names of the enslaved and free Black people that worked and lived at the farmhouse. They are available on our website, and proceeds support further research and educational programming on the topic of the enslaved and free people highlighted on the shirt. We continue to create programming and art exhibitions that highlight the Black experience in New York City. We would also like to rethink our interpretation, starting perhaps with the Winter Kitchen, with the goal of telling a more comprehensive history of and for our community. Hope you'll follow us on social media. And thank you so much for attending and listening. I would like to kick it off next and hand it off to my colleague, Lizela Franz.
Thanks, Meredith. The story of that burying ground is heart-wrenching. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. The organization, now known as Historic Huguenot Street, was founded in 1894, and that makes it among the earliest historic preservation organizations of its kind in the United States. Like many other such entities, Huguenot Street was in some ways emulating the earliest preservation organization, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which had been established in 1854. It's no surprise that the site was founded while the colonial revival was flourishing in the years following the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876, because by this point, New Paltz was changing significantly with the arrival of the railroad, trolley lines, a growing tourism industry, and the arrival of newer immigrants, primarily from Southern Europe. The original stated purpose of the society was similar in tone and intent, I think, to the purposes of a growing number of historical societies that were cropping up nationally. The statement reads, "The business of the Huguenot Patriotic Historical and Monumental Society of New Paltz shall be to record the virtues and perpetuate the memory of the Huguenot patentees of New Paltz and of the early settlers upon the New Paltz patent by erecting and maintaining a suitable monument to the patentees at New Paltz Village." The society would eventually obtain and preserve 7 18th century historic stone houses and construct a replica of an early French church. Of course, this narrowly focused purpose belies the full breadth of history and the multicultural stories that are so representative of the Mid-Atlantic region, the Hudson Valley, and the site itself, which had been home to the Esopus Muncie of the Lenape people for thousands of years, early Dutch colonists, enslaved Africans forcibly brought here by those colonists, the French-speaking Protestants the organization was founded to interpret, and English colonists. The most recent examination of our mission occurred in 2019, and as is typical, it was done in the context of strategic planning. As important as acknowledging the diversity of the site's history is, establishing the contemporary relevance is also a critical component of the revised mission. In acknowledging before every program, as we did today, that historic Huguenot Street is situated on lands originally inhabited by the Esopus Muncie, and that the site continues to serve as the homeland of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians, now located in Wisconsin, we are striving to cement that contemporary relevance. Construction of a replica wigwam in 2017 enabled us to integrate the Indigenous story into site tours, but their significant history is also woven into our array of programming, which has included a seminar called Brotherhood and Belonging, which was a program highlighting Hendrik Alpama, a Mohican Revolutionary War hero and diplomat. In Her Words, which was a theatrical presentation highlighting Manvet, a Sachem signer of the 1677 land agreement between the Huguenot patentees and Esopus Munsee, a program that explored the power of Native women and regularly offered virtual Lenape language workshops taught by Karen Moscow of the Munsee Delaware Nation in Ontario, Canada. The Dutch presence and influence are evident in architecture throughout the site, including the Abraham Hasbrook and Bevier Elting houses, and in the museum's collections of costume and other decorative arts, as well as in the manuscript collection. Display and interpretation of these allow us to explore the blending of Dutch and French cultures, which persists even today. Perhaps most important, though, it allows us to present the harsh truth that the Huguenot patentees immediately embraced slavery, as had the Dutch, as a means towards economic gain. The 7 historic houses from the early 18th century allow us to interpret the living quarters and workspaces, but we are also working to ensure that the names and stories of the enslaved are woven into every facet of tours, and that the personal lives of enslaved and generations that followed are explored in an array of programmatic offerings and exhibitions, both physical and online. These have included partnership with organizations such as the Slave Dwelling Project in South Carolina and TMI in Kingston. Exhibits such as Never Was a Slave, Jacob Wynkoop, Free and Black in 19th Century New Pulse, and at events like Juneteenth and Pinkster celebrations. None of these efforts have been at the expense of exploring the site's distinct history of its French-speaking Protestants. Unlike other Huguenot refugees, the New Pulse Walloons made their way from the northern region of France near the Belgian border, ultimately arriving in the Hudson Valley. Because they left France prior to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, they were able to leave with their possessions and wealth, an important distinction from other refugees. Their relocation is not believed to be purely based on religious belief, but also on the pursuit of continued financial prosperity. The 1677 land agreement between the Huguenots and Esopus Munsee was likely understood very differently by the patentees and indigenous signers, with the Europeans claiming it as a purchase of the 40,000-acre tract of land, while the Esopus Munsee likely understood it as allowing the Europeans the shared use of the land. Interpreting these diverse stories has presented a number of challenges for the institution. Past archaeological investigations have revealed the significance of the site to Indigenous history. Excavations indicate that the lands were home to Native Americans for more than 8,000 years, and that the presence of substantial Native settlements make the site sacred. HHS has worked closely with tribal representatives to honor and protect their history through responsible stewardship, and we strive to improve on that front on an ongoing basis. There's a need to balance this with the archaeology that is sometimes required in the state's environmental quality review process as part of preservation efforts on the stone structures. Also, collections are not as representative of the multicultural history as we'd like them to be, particularly because collecting priorities historically were focused on the European inhabitants. With little documentation on the lives of the enslaved who resided on the 10-acre site and surrounding area, we have had to rely on other sources, such as the narratives of a Sojourner Truth, to convey to the public what life was like for those enslaved in the Hudson Valley. Third, the site's complicated history can be overwhelming, and we have found it challenging to develop a compelling story that conveys its rich history in the time frame of an hour or so tour. Effective interpretive planning is needed and is an institutional priority. It's a process we're just starting on now. And finally, representation at the highest levels is critical. The Board of Trustees, scholarly advisors, committee members, outside consultants, and collaborators all contribute to our presentation of tours, exhibitions, programs, and publications. Overall, while significant progress has been made in the years since way back when in 1894, we recognize that our interpretive offerings will continue to evolve as we gain a better understanding of all those who live their lives on this remarkable site. And with that, I will turn this program over to Lavada Nahon from New York State Parks.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. I want to thank everyone for this opportunity to be here and share with you today. And I also want to thank my colleagues who have gone before me. A lot, actually everything they spoke of happening at their individual sites and locations around New York State represents a small part of what I have the pleasure to be involved in on a state level. As a member of the team at People's Island Resource Center, the home of BHS and a part of the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, it is amazing and overwhelming all that is happening around reinterpreting history for our state. My colleagues represent a small portion. I was not really prepared for the larger portion that is the state. And so that's 35 historic sites and historic parks and 182 parks and SHPO, the Preservation Department. My colleagues are showing the early part of New York State's history, the colonial New Nation period. But for us at Parks, it is the entire timeline of the state. We are currently continuing a process that started over 30 years ago with the opening of Ganondagan, which is our whole history. This initiative was started in January 2021 officially in the governor's State of the State address. It is not one story, but many. But the stories changed depending upon the time and the place, who is undertold, when and where. But the key is no one is ever alone. And if they are, we need to ask why. These are the types of questions and thoughts that we keep in mind as we work on the state level. So we have the individual historic sites, we have parks, we have historic preservation. First, all of these places are located on native lands. So that is always a story that we have to be looking for. The historic sites are in different regions and at different points of time. They work hand in hand with People's Island Resource Center. The Resource Center covers archaeology, conservation, interpretation, and preservation. Because we are covering the whole state, we can't do everything ourselves at the Resource Center. So we also work with outside contractors. We have to be aware of whether or not they are following our whole history narrative. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. We are also heavily impacted by the public, whether that is our friends groups, the foundations that work with our parks or historic sites, the general public that are visitors who read a sign and see something missing, or read a sign that they don't agree with, or take a tour that leaves them questioning. To reach out to parks, they then often go through the public relations department or the governor's office. And our eyes and awareness is always also on what's happening at the National Park Service. All of these all of these parts are always moving and are part of our everyday work. When we look at broadening the story, bringing those undertold stories forward, what happens at one site, research that happens in one place, ripples across the entire state. We have to be very aware even of scripts that were written 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Research is being done all of the time. People are going back into collections now with fresh eyes, finding people who were not there, finding stories who were not there. They're going back into their individual collections, looking at objects, looking at items. So we are constantly researching, reinterpreting, researching, reprogramming, researching, rethinking, renaming, respeaking. Something's how someone self-identified even 5 years ago is not how they may identify themselves now. A letter from the 18th century that someone read 10 years ago, someone picking up that letter today will see something different. That impacts everything we do and all the steps that we will be using as we go forward. And that's not just at the historic sites. That is also at the parks. When a state commission like the Suffrage Commission puts together a request for statues and selects someone like Sojourner Truth that ended up at the entrance of Walkway over the Hudson, then People's Island interpretive team comes in and helps create the signage. The Parks blog gives a news piece on that. The Parks website gives digital space for that, more access to that. As we move forward, programming will come off of that, not just at this one location, but her narrative impacts all of New York. So all of that is back and forth. Even when we look at parts for doing something like illuminating the Niagara Falls, to bring Juneteenth forward, to bring Black history forward, then what does that mean? It is about allowing the public then to find out. It isn't a conversation in a meeting where the base conversation was illuminating the falls for pride, for the LGBTQ plus community. All of that. So what does that mean to people? So that is interpretation. Every time we bring one undertold community story forward, we must always be aware of those other undertold stories, whether that is gender, whether that is culture or race, whether that is socioeconomics. If we are, the state is offered land that is a working class community, that is a part of the story that has not been told in a lot of our history. We want to preserve those at the top, not those in the middle or those on the bottom. So all of that awareness plays into everything we do. Even in park signs now, we have an initiative that says, all are welcome here. Reinterpreting that story for people that allows them to be comfortable and present somewhere where in our state's history, they may not have felt they belong. Historic preservation, CHIPA, the places we choose to save or remember. How do we choose to do that? Reinterprets history. There is a push now to start saving places that are related to African-American history. There is a desire and push to save places that represent women's history and workers' history, the immigrant story. All of that is work that when we consider reinterpreting history, that it's not just one particular time period or one particular group. When we were working as a state agency, we are embracing all of this history, all of these stories. We're having to look at our own bias constantly. We take the trainings, but then we have to apply that even to the signage that we write, even to a request for new research. Even when we look at objects that through one European view, we really have to stop and take a breath and then broaden that. What other communities are impacted by a simple chair? What other communities were impacted by a letter? What other communities, other people, other genders, other cultures are impacted by an archaeological dig where human remains are found? All of that, all of these changes are the work. I am privileged to be a part of an amazing team doing work that has started and continues. And it is very exciting, very challenging, but very exciting to see New York really, both from a state level, a public level, and a private level, be willing to bring a more fuller and richer narrative out for ourselves, our students, and the thousands of visitors who come here from all over the world. So I thank you. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Suzanne Clary.
Okay. Oh. Okay. I'm trying to start my video here, and maybe I can get some help from Katie. Thank you. And kudos to all of our panelists and presenters. We have almost 200 people signed on listening to this program, and very excited to move forward with the discussion, a very powerful discussion. I'd like to ask a few questions of my own to start us off, though. You've all talked about the importance of archaeology, the impact that was relevant in all the panelists' discussions. Are there projects that you would like to do, that you would like to get funded, and how difficult is that? You know, how do you prioritize, as Liselle was talking about prioritizing your agenda for the year and your budgets with doing the archaeology that's really necessary to tell your stories?
If I could just jump in, because our situation may be a little different at Huguenot Street. We're at a point right now where we feel less is more, and that we really needed to stop our archaeological investigations, because we had hosted an archaeological field school for SUNY New Paltz for a couple of decades. So in one sense, of course, we've learned tremendous amounts of information, but at the same time, in recent years, we've recognized that this is sacred ground, and we should just leave well enough alone unless a preservation project drives that need. So, you know, very particular investigations around the historic structures, but that otherwise we need to respect and honor the sacredness of the site. So we want to do as little as possible at this point.
Interesting. Donnamarie, you talked about clearing land and doing ground penetrating radar. That's very expensive. You need funding for that. How do we encourage funders to realize how important this work is to helping us reframe the narrative at historic sites?
Absolutely, Suzanne. So because we're a nonprofit, we depend on donations, grants. We are applying to various foundations for funding. And as all of us know, that's a painstaking, long process, and there is nothing guaranteed. We have a dedicated group of donors, and as we expand and tell our story in fuller ways, and actually this past year of having to do major programming on Zoom, I think for all of us has widened our circle of attendance. We've been able to reach more people in a wider area, not just our immediate communities, which has brought in new participants and visitors to our sites, to our online presence, and slowly to our donor base. So again, it's, yes, our archaeological project moving forward. We are looking for funders, help, suggestions, donations. All are welcome.
Mhm.
And it is an ongoing, it's an ongoing endeavor, I think, for every nonprofit organization that's engaged in doing this work.
Well, I mean, I loved looking at the object that you had studied, and you could tell that there was the influence of at least three different individuals on that one object. And I think everyone seems to agree that we have certain things in our collections that are existing and don't tell the whole story. And it seems to me that, archaeology is one avenue of expanding that collection by taking things from the earth, from the landscape, to help tell the whole story. Have any of you been in touch with descendants of enslaved men or women associated with your site who might themselves have papers or artifacts to share with you?
Again, I'll say that no, we do not have contact with a descendant community yet. We're ever hopeful that someone will come forward and have made the connection, but we haven't at present. We have a connection to another site on Long Island, Lloyd's Manor. The Lloyd's family and the Sylvester families were intermarried, and they also shared an enslaved family, actually the family of Tamara and Oyo. Their son Obium went to live at Lloyd's Manor. He is the father of Jupiter Hammond, the first African-American poet. So in that way, as I mentioned, many of our organizations, our historic sites are connected through family relations, through the relations of the enslaved and the indigenous people. And all of that more and more is being developed, and hopefully at some point, maybe we will have a connected descendant community.
And if I may, one of the things I think is important, a lot of people right now, it's not so much about having new archaeology, but having people go back into the collections that they already have and looking at them. Because I was just privileged to be part of a presentation from New York State Museum and the Resource Center, where looking at archaeologists at the museum are going back and looking at some of the early digs. A lot of information around the enslaved has already been found, but the language and the desire to interpret that material was not in place when it was located. And so things have just been sitting. And a lot of those artifacts the public has never seen. So we have presence of cowrie shells, we've got presence of dakinga, we've got so many artifacts that are just small bits, blue beads and pins and things like that, that people now, we need to go back and start crafting the language to pull that information forward. It is always a desire to do more, but sometimes that more is not about putting up a new hole. The more is sometimes having to study cultures that we have never studied. And giving the interpretive staff and the museum staffs the language and the understanding to be able to talk to people about those who are part of the undertold stories. It's not just about their presence here, but also where did they come from? What was their cultures? And we don't study Africa, and that's really important.
That's a great point, Lavada. Absolutely a great point. I want to ask Meredith about her art installation, the art exhibit too. I mean, because it seems to me that artists can help us look at the existing artifacts and illuminate them, to Lavada's point too, that's one way to re-examine them with new eyes and a new light. Can you tell us more about the reactions to your exhibit?
Sure. These different changing exhibitions we've been doing since 2019. We're in a neighborhood that has a lot of artists. We're in the last affordable neighborhood in Manhattan. And so in working with artists, especially on this topic and talking about enslavement and the history of a little bit more of a comprehensive history of the farmhouse and of the community, what we've found is it really is a great entry point to start having these conversations with visitors. It's much easier to talk about this artist and this piece that they created and what you're seeing in this room and start the dialogue there than to start it in another way. So what I've noticed, certainly, and my staff has noticed, is that this really is a great entry point into having conversations about topics that people may find challenging, may not want to have, but that's the history. So we found it tremendously helpful and really engaging for people.
Again, going back to the fact that we are sort of emerging from, we're still on Zoom, but we're emerging more and more from COVID. I'd love to hear from all of you, what your pandemic experience was as far as increased visitation, whether it was through Zoom, as Donnamarie mentioned, or even just outdoor visitation. I mean, whatever your size, I mean, there's a range of sizes here. We have the Dyckman Farmhouse, which is half an acre, and Sylvester Manor, which is 240 acres. I know our site in Wright, the J Estate, we're about 23 acres, but we saw, outdoor visitation just, surge, and there was a demand for increased interpretation of the landscape. So could you all speak to that a little bit? And Lavada, perhaps you can speak to it as well, because I know all the historic sites and parks that you listed, were probably reaching out to you throughout the pandemic too.
I think it sort of depends on where you're located. For us, we had almost zero attendance on the landscape. We were obviously working from home for a period of time, but once we opened up, we had almost no people spending time outside, surprisingly enough. But of course, we had hugely inflated numbers for virtual programs.
And that's where it was flipped, actually, on the state level. We did some virtual programming, but a lot of the sites and parks really did not have the technology to be able to flip to the digital platform. But the landscapes across the board, New York State parks hit record numbers. And so people then became curious because they were at the historic sites, and particularly the historic parks. And then we've gained land in some of our parks too. So as people are going through, it is a huge impact, but that's where we gained the bodies on the ground, but we lost the digital presence.
For us, you did mention we have a large landscape, and because so many city people moved then to the East End of Long Island to their Hamptons homes, our visitorship went up tremendously. We were some days averaging 100 people coming through. We have a trail system that was open. It's open to walk your dog on a leash, to bring your children, to walk the grounds. The Manor House was closed, and like Meredith's staff, we were working from home. But we found that we needed to bring our story outside, literally, by implementing a walking tour app. So I was creating a narrative for different stations on the app, our signage, and this year then, as post-pandemic, the way that it's all sort of reinterpreted itself is that this year, instead of using the Manor House for public guided tours, I'm now doing guided tours outside in the landscape. So I'm offering two different tours, one a 90-minute, mile-and-a-half walk around the perimeter of the property through the wooded trail to tell the stories. And then a smaller 45-minute sort of core around the house tour. And it's done many things. It's opened up the story. For me, it's a new innovative way to tell the story and not be dependent on the house or to get caught up in the story of the artifacts and the tchotchkes, as it were, inside, but to really be able to focus on the individuals that I'm talking about and the continuation of the land in the narrative as we walk along. So in that, and we've also implemented new kinds of tours, a tour of our windmill, a farm tour of the farm operation, a sustainability tour of the systems that we use for sustaining the property. an outdoor youth camp, a theater camp. So it's really sort of changed our thinking a little bit of how to use the outside as an important way to tell our narrative and not depend on the historic house.
If I may, I just want to, I'm sorry, Liselle, just correct something. Last year we did introduce a New York State Park app. So people are able then to get onto the parks. And then there were, for us, the environmental educators also picked up a lot of the historic information that went with the parks, that they were able to do some presentations. So for us on state level, it really was about using a variety of technology.
And at Huguenot Street, we too have walking tour apps in a couple of different languages. And I think that the site, because it is a park-like setting and adjacent to the rail trail, people really found it as a refuge during the pandemic. And, you know, fortunately, we've been expanding our interpretive signage on the site. But once we got the hang of virtual programming, we're kind of victims of our own success, I think, because we recognize it's a really great way to expand your audience geographically. We had participants from throughout the US and abroad for many of our offerings. And in particular, I think opportunities like these Lenape language workshops with the presenter, coming live and streaming in from Canada is just a really unique opportunity. And we know we have to continue to do those kinds of programs in addition to being at full capacity again, physically. So it's, with the same number of staff, of course, so.
Right there. Well, thank you all. I want to get to some of the questions from our audience in the Q&A. From Kate Emery, Meredith mentioned a number of priorities for reinterpretation at Dyckman. How did the museum come to choose those priorities, and is the community involved in the process of asking the questions and creating a more complete story?
Sure. A lot of this is based off of feedback from our community. We are definitely not a museum that just wants to cram information down people's throats, no matter what they want to know. But we do feel that it's really important for us to tell a comprehensive history of our community. So, we receive a ton of feedback from visitors of literally all ages on our winter kitchen, which is why we've really thought about starting in that space. That's one of the most engaging spaces in the house for everyone from 3 to 93. And also as soon as we started this project, we started hosting community conversation programs with our community to engage them in a dialogue, not only about the research that we were doing and kind of letting them know what kinds of information that we were finding, but also getting feedback from them about what kinds of things they would like to know, what kind of connections they're seeing between, their lives in the Dominican Republic, let's say, and some of the things that they've seen in the kitchen at the Dyckman Farmhouse. So we've really tried to foster that kind of dialogue so that what we're presenting ultimately is includes feedback from the community.
And I imagine the rest of you also, reach out to the community in different ways, whether it's through focus groups or newsletters or gatherings. Are there organizations local organizations that you all work with, that you sort of rely on for feedback from the community, like a regular group of organizations? I mean, obviously many and the Preservation League of New York State are wonderful resources, but I'm thinking like really, in your neighborhood, let's say in New Paltz for Liselle, or, out on Shelter Island for Donnamarie.
Two of our core groups that we regularly communicate with are SUNY New Paltz. We have a tremendous number of interns from the college. As I mentioned, they had done the field school for decades. We have a lot of interaction with the college's community, as well as school teachers in the districts that typically visit us. They'll field test our programs. We converted all of our programs to virtual offerings and got input from them on that. And during the strategic planning process, we tried to bring together diverse, focus groups to help us in that process. And we kind of pulled from a variety of different segments of the community to make sure it was diverse and representative. So those are kind of three that come to my mind immediately.
And I like that you mentioned SUNY New Paltz too, because I think working with a university or local school definitely adds to the breadth of not only your discussion, but also I know for us at the J Estate, we worked with the Historic Preservation Department of Columbia University, and we brought in these new students who Lavada like very looking at things that we've been looking at for so long. Meredith, Donnamarie, do you have any links with institutions like that? Either,
Yes, yes, we do. Many of our papers, up to 10,000 of our documents, were donated to NYU's Fales Library, where they've been preserved, digitized, and are available online. So that's been an ongoing relationship. As I mentioned, our archaeology has been done by UMass Boston. We are entering into a new partnership with NYU for a postgraduate internship, someone who will go through the documents in the Fales Library to pull out pertinent information that I, as curator and archivist, and the rest of our staff just don't have time to really go through it and find specific things that we're needing for the narratives and for the histories, things that we may have overlooked. Lavada mentioned going back into your own collections to really see what's there, things that were passed over or didn't catch your eye or didn't stir a thought, now suddenly jump out at you. And it's almost like, oh my God, how did I miss this? How did I not see this piece of pertinent information? We also have a great relationship with the local Shelter Island public school system. We have a program where students come to visit Sylvester Manor and learn about its history starting in pre-K through 12th grade. We are also working with some local educators to start to develop a curriculum, a more inclusive curriculum about local history. And hopefully having a further outreach to other school systems on the east end of Long Island.
For us,
go ahead, Meredith.
Okay, sorry. For us, the people that we kind of collaborate with most are numerous. We have a great collaboration with Fordham University, which has a campus south of us and a campus north of us. We have hosted Columbia University preservation classes to do case studies at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. We also have a great relationship with the Cooperstown Graduate Program and do an annual immersion program with their graduate students and host them for summer internships. And then for programming, we also work with, the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance, who is just a few blocks north of us. And they're the ones that are really helpful in helping us identify artists for our art installations. We work closely with the New York City Parks Department, which is the owner of the property that we're on. And then, we're part of this Northern Slavery Consortium that includes most of the people on this panel. So it's great to have a whole host of colleagues to be able to ask questions of and reach out to.
Oh, interesting. Can you tell us more about that? That's the first I've heard of that. The slavery inclusion panel.
Lavada, do you want to talk about that?
Yes, so it's, we actually did switch the name a little bit. So it's the Northern Slavery Collective. It started about 2 years ago on behalf of Historic Hudson Valley, reached out to people who were doing the enslavement period. And we gathered at the Upper Mills in Tarrytown, and all of us said the same thing. We needed support, we needed each other, and we wanted to keep in touch. Last year we met virtually, and now we are gathering. We now have a Facebook page, just opened a group page literally within the last month. And we are really trying to support the work around enslavement in New York that is happening, but we all felt like we were working in a silo. The Dutch period is still really not known, really not understood. Enslavement is still, we all talk about constantly, people coming up to us saying, I didn't know there was slavery in New York. And this is something that we battle every day. So it is a collective. We invite anyone who's interested, please go to the Facebook page, Northern Slavery Collective, and join. We are
Stephanie
gathering.
just wrote it in the chat.
Yeah, we're gathering
Yeah.
this fall in a virtual meeting, and we really just want to, what's happening at different sites? Who's doing research? What are you uncovering, to get this information out? So when we talk about who is supporting us, we are trying to start supporting ourselves. Across the state, we have relationships with different colleges, different universities, the friends groups, the foundations, connected. But it is community, particularly of our colleagues, that I think has been the weakest link for me at least, about getting that support. Just who are my peeps?
That sounds like a great resource for a lot of the people who are listening to this program right now. We should definitely put a link. Oh, thank you. I think we have a link in the chat now. That's fantastic. That's wonderful. Donnamarie, you were going to add something.
Oh, no, just that coming together, that first meeting, which was literally maybe 10 days before lockdown of the pandemic, was actually very electric, and just meeting like-minded colleagues who were doing the same work was an amazing gathering, and we would have continued to have met in person if not for the pandemic. So it's very exciting that we have a new Facebook page and that we're going to continue to further this work.
All right, I have another question. Everyone is thanking you for all your contributions. Can you talk about your experience with public demand and expectations that our historic sites should be representing this fuller and more nuanced history? And so that question goes hand in hand with another question about fatigue, about how do we engage people who may not be as receptive to this push for broad and inclusivity and feel fatigued about being told undertold stories. What are your experiences at your sites with those reactions from the public?
I'll jump in here. We never actually received any feedback from community members saying, hey, why don't you talk about this? However, once we started talking about it, we started to get feedback that was like, oh, wow, this is so amazing that you're talking about this. So, and this is from, a person who lives across the street in the apartment building, and like so many members of the community, I think, started to really take notice of the museum and started to actually get interested in and engage with the museum. Once we started talking about my history, their history, the complete history of, a more complete history of the community, not just the wealthy European landowners. So it was interesting to see that. In terms of the fatigue, I've not received that feedback either. But to me, this is important. So it's something that I'm not going to stop doing if people feel like I'm kind of saturated. We try to make sure that our programs and the things that we do, like our art installations, are really interesting and engaging for people. So it's not meant to be a sledgehammer over the head, but we are going to talk about it. And so, that's who we've decided that we are as an organization.
Yes, I'll add to that. Just, I also have not experienced any fatigue, and like Meredith, this is the story that we're telling, and we work very hard to make Sylvester Manor the place where you can come and ask those questions that you may feel embarrassed about, such as, I didn't know that there was slavery in New York. I didn't know that there was slavery on Long Island. I didn't know that New York abolished slavery in 1827. Why didn't anyone ever tell me this? Why wasn't I ever taught that? Those are the constant refrains. And then I think when you tell these stories, when you name these individuals, when you place them in the history, there is a new understanding, a broader understanding, a fuller understanding. This is not about blame, and this is not about shame. This is about understanding and recognizing that this is a land of diversity and always has been from the very beginning. And that people of color helped to build these very buildings, these historic sites, all of these pretty houses, all of these wonderful rooms with this wonderful furniture and artifacts. People of color built those places. And if we know their names and we can put their names to it and say, so-and-so built this house or was on the team of master craftsmen who worked on this woodwork or whatever it is, it gives it a deeper resonance, and it gives the visitor a deeper understanding and appreciation, because when they leave, those are the names that they'll remember, and they'll never be able to pass that site again without remembering that you said that Jacob cut down the trees and trimmed the lumber that built this house, or that Hannah was the woman who worked in the kitchen and helped the owner's wife birth 11 children safely and successfully. Once you know their names, you can't ever forget them. And that's really the purpose of all of the work that we're doing.
And I think interpreting kind of against the grain of what people come, they come to a site like Huguenot Street with very particular expectations that they're going to learn a lot about Huguenots, but the relevance isn't there for most visitors. I think that, by really highlighting the multicultural history of the site, we're inviting people to explore the relevance to their own lives. And so that I don't think anybody would be fatigued by that. I think it just helps them connect in a way that before they would come here more out of a curiosity about somebody else's story. Whereas now it's really in part their story.
I think
with the,
go ahead, Lavada.
With the state sites, it's all across the board. People really are engaged, but the challenges are both for engaging ourselves as those who are doing the interpretation, relearning their history ourselves, so we can get people engaged in a fuller story. It is, we have sites that are deep diving and doing amazing reports, and we have sites who are taking a deep breath and saying, how do I step in and tell a story that's not mine? And I'm saying, but it is yours because it is the culture story. And I think that's one of the things that as colleagues and as professionals within the field that we're really not talking about, that I think that we really should address, is how are we as individuals telling different people's the fuller cultural story? How is that impacting us? And how is that causing us to look at so we can share from a more centered place? Because that is, the public wants, if we say, well, I don't feel comfortable telling the enslaved story because that's not my ancestry, that's not my people, that comes off. If you feel that way and you're trying to interpret or speak to the public on a new script, your hesitation comes off. So we, as those who are in the field, have to start looking at ourselves as part of the culture, a wholeness, and putting that into our interpretation. And that, for me, alleviates the fatigue, because you also alleviate the stress and the boredom.
So we've got so many great questions. So I want to try and get through all of them. Sarah Wasberg Johnson, how much staff time do you devote to original research? Or do you largely outsource research to interns, volunteers, contract researchers? How much of it is done in-house, or is it all done in-house? And people are curious about this. I know we have lots of volunteers over the years who've helped transcribe documents, and we're constantly teaching them how to, read old handwriting, which is almost a lost art. Can you tell us a little bit more about the research process?
Sure, I can jump in here. So I don't outsource it, and I am the history department. And I can say pre-pandemic, I used to spend most of the winter doing research, either from our own collection of documents or from the NYU collection, going to the Fales Library to look at primary source documents in person. Post-pandemic, several things happened because we took all of our programming online. The winter slow period never happened. I don't think we're going to ever have a slow season again. And so a lot of the research that I was doing sort of took a back seat to Zoom presentations. But I do most of the research myself. This summer, I have expanded to include not just Sylvester Manor, but I'm doing broader research for Shelter Island and part of another project that I'm involved in called the Plain Side Project, in which we are uncovering the names and the numbers of enslaved and free people of color on the east end of Long Island, and using local library, historic archives, and historical societies. One such discovery at the Shelter Island Historical Society was a record from the local school, the Free Union School System, dated 1765, a listing of students and the days that they attended school. And one of the listings in this booklet that someone must have been looking at for years was a single entry, and it said, Eunice, colored girl, that she had attended school in Shelter Island in 1765 for 87 days that year. Now, this means that Eunice may be the first child of color to attend a public school here on Shelter Island. That makes her a very special person in my eyes in the history of this community. But because, you know, you weren't looking for it, maybe it wasn't seen until I was looking for it, and I wasn't even looking for it. I was just looking through a book. So the answer to that is you do it when you can. By reading different things, looking at new account books, or just taking the time to go through papers and just re-looking at it, you glean new information from it. It is time consuming. And as we tell bigger stories, attract more public attention, have more visitors, give more tours, the time becomes precious and harder to sneak away to sort of spend time in the 18th and 19th century looking at old handwriting. So it's an ongoing process, and hopefully moving into the future, we will all have either bigger budgets or funding sources that will enable us to have more volunteers or more paid staff to help expand the research.
And of course, at Huguenot Street, there's a body of research that exists from decades and decades past, but I think looking at it with new eyes raises new questions that we then do more applied research for upcoming program initiatives. So trying to build on that research in new ways, but also really critical to our offerings is the existence of a body of scholarly advisors, because the nuance, you know, of what we're trying to interpret is kind of a little scary, frankly. I think you want to get it right. And so having people that we can turn to and ask them to review scripts or check in with them about, and Lavada has been called on, I can't tell you how many times, so informally, but just an amazing resource, gives us the confidence that Lavada was talking about earlier, when we are conveying some important historical themes to the public, that we are getting it right.
And for us,
go ahead.
we
Meredith.
keep doing this, Lavada. For us, we have a full-time staff of 3, including myself. So there is not one person who's dedicated to anything. We just don't have the time. So for us, research really only happens when we have an internship project, a graduate school project, or when, in the case of the New York Community Trust grant, where we've got grant funding to hire someone to conduct research.
And research on the state level is happening everywhere. We have a conversation with someone about why a community is changed, an intern or a staff person steps in and does that. Someone has a personal interest, like Jess over Schuyler, goes deep dives into Hamilton, and suddenly it's changing the world of how we look at him. People are going back into signs. We have, for the first time, an interpreter helping us, an intern helping us from UAlbany as we're finding research for Phillips Manor Hall's reinterpretation. We read all the time, and it's never enough time. I mean, we have books and papers. The biggest challenge I think that all of us face, particularly with New York history, is so much of it is still in the documents. So we really don't have, like Southern history, you know, we're not 5 or 6 books away from the documents. Most of us are like a half a book away from the documents. And one of the major contributors to that documentation has in fact actually just transitioned this week, A.J. Williams-Meyer. I mean, his scholarship, we all depend on. And we have a level, whether that's Charles Gearing or Peter Rose. I mean, there's a level of our foundational scholars in our area who are elders. And what all of us need are young people to step up to the plate, more volunteers. But we really, as historians in New York, research is critical, and not having enough people to do it is crippling all of us. And it is something that we need to address.
But I think that is the perfect note to end on. We're going over just a couple of minutes, but I'm amazed by all the wonderful, I'm not amazed. I mean, this has been such a great program with such great contributions. People want to volunteer, they want to get engaged. Hopefully they want to donate too, but the idea of encouraging and inspiring new voices, people with new eyes to be inclusive and find all that new information that is still in documents or in archives or hasn't really been looked at enough. I think the responses from our audience are very, very encouraging. So I just want to thank you all for your time and for this conversation today. I want to do it again. I mean, I'd love to do a follow-up to this. But thank you all so much for your passion, your dedication, all of the things that you are doing to help reframe and retell the stories that need to be told. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie to wrap things up.
Hi, thank you all so much. This really was fantastic. I so appreciate all the work that you're doing and taking time out of your busy day to be with us and to talk to everyone who tuned in. I just want to give you all a chance to give your last 2 cents, anything that you want to leave us on before we wrap this up today.
I find the work of everybody here very inspiring, and you talk about fatigue. I mean, there's a lot coming at us financially and otherwise, worrying about variance and things like that. But the work we're doing is really, really important, and I think things like programs like this just reinforce that for me. So thank you.
It's been fantastic, and follow through. If you're curious about something you heard today, please follow through.
Yeah,
Thank you, everybody, for being here and with us. I think generally I can say for all of the panel that we love the work that we do. We are dedicated and passionate about it. We are called to do it, to tell these stories, to unearth these histories. And I invite everyone to come and visit all of our various sites, visit our websites, and please donate. Thank you.
Absolutely. I reiterate everything that everyone just said. I think, when you were asking Suzanne, who are these resources that you reach out to? Obviously, we all have a huge list of those resources, but one of the most important ones, I think, is having these colleagues who have, these shared experiences with, who are really here to help kind of support, because as Liselle said, we have a lot of things going on at once, and so it can be tiring, but it's obviously a labor of love.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did drop in the chat links to everybody's websites and their volunteer pages. So you can scroll through the chat to find that. Otherwise, like I said in the beginning, this is recorded. So we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel and on our website. So I'll include links to all of the things that got mentioned in this presentation on our website as well. So that should be posted in the next few days in case anybody wants to relive this magic. I know I might. So thank you all again for tuning in. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Suzanne, for moderating. This really was great, and I'm just so inspired by the work that you all are doing, and I can't wait to see what else we can do together and keep pushing it forward, because there's a lot of state in New York. There are a lot of historic sites, and there's a lot of great stories to tell. And, you all kind of give me hope that we're going to tell them and get more people interested in history and historic sites. And I'm just very grateful. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.